Niall Ferguson on the relevance of today's rituals and their meaning in conflicts, past and present. And with us throughout the morning, three independent-minded insiders. Former Downing Street Communications Director under Boris Johnson, Guto Harry. The former Lib Dem advisor turned columnist, Miranda Green. And the broadcaster, Sangeeta Maiska. Here we go, everybody. Good luck. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Yesterday, 300,000 people marched largely peacefully through London in support of Palestinians in Gaza. But the crowds were infiltrated by some extremists. The Met is investigating placards, headwear and hate speech. And some protesters were held and searched after fireworks were launched at police. Back here at Westminster, I witnessed crowds of far-right and football hooligans called counter-protesters by the Met. There was fighting, violence, attacks on police, and more than 80 arrests. It was a tough day for the police, but they were generally successful, and London's streets did not descend into a total battleground. The Prime Minister condemned what he called despicable actions from a minority on both sides. Questions still hang over the future of the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, this morning. On the cenotaph, the inscription, penned by Rudyard Kipling, consists of just 3 words: the glorious dead. Perhaps as we discuss the sound and fury of words around Westminster, we might keep in mind that in Israel, in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Darfur this morning, there are plenty of dead, but precious little glory. The great Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz once described war as the continuation of policy with other means. In other words, a failure of politics. Let's see if our politicians today can come up with some answers that might get the guns to fall silent. I can speak now to the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. Good morning, Ms. Cooper. I think you're at home before going to Remembrance service. Why do you think...
That's right, we have a Remembrance service in Castleford this morning that I'll be joining shortly.
Why do you think that this moment still feels so relevant today, more than 100 years on from the end of World War I?
I think Remembrance is about communities coming together, showing respect for each other, but particularly to commemorate those who we lost, those who gave their lives to keep us all safe through generations, and to remember them, to remember their families, to pay tribute to our armed forces, but all those who serve to keep us safe and to stand up for the values of our democracy, the values of our freedom. We
saw a very different spirit in some parts of London yesterday. Were you, as the Shadow Home Secretary, content with the way the Metropolitan Police handled it?
Well, I think for Remembrance Weekend, the Armistice Day yesterday, we did want to see everybody coming together. And we saw some appalling scenes in the capital, both the far-right groups, the thuggish violence and attacks towards police officers. We also saw some deeply appalling cases of anti-Semitism that are still being investigated now. But I want to thank the police for the work that they did to make sure that Armistice events weren't disrupted. They said that's what they would do. That is exactly what they did. And they did have to endure these attacks on them, as well as the considerable policing challenges in the capital. And I am very concerned that the government made it harder for the police to do their jobs, including both in inflaming tensions, but also undermining confidence and respect in the police exactly when both the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister needed to be backing the police. And I really think they should also be thanking the police for the work they did in very difficult circumstances.
The Prime Minister has issued a statement this morning. Were you surprised that there were no words of thanks for the police in his statement?
To be honest, I was just shocked that there wasn't a word of thanks for the police in the statement. We saw police under attack, having missiles thrown at them and having to deal with people who were trying to climb over fences, climbing onto walls to try and get to the cenotaph. The police made sure that they didn't, and we should thank them for that. And this comes when the Home Secretary launched this really appalling and unprecedented attack on the police, on both their operational independence and also on their impartiality. I've never seen any Home Secretary do what Suella Braverman did, and there's good reason for that. The events that we saw yesterday around the Armistice, those are the reasons why no Home Secretary has ever done anything like this before, and it was irresponsible. So I think especially in that context, it's really important for the Prime Minister to thank the police for what they've done.
I want to come back to the matter of the Home Secretary in a moment, but you yourself aspire to be Home Secretary. And let's deal with the central point that she made. The march was largely peaceful. As we've been saying, the police essentially managed it. But were you Home Secretary, had rather that this march did not take place this weekend?
So I think what we want is for communities to be able to come together. Whether marches take place is an operational matter for the police, and it's right that we should support the police in making that operational decision.
I want to come back to the operational point, but
be decided by politicians. But there is a really important
given this
point
weekend,
about
would you rather had not seen that march take place this weekend?
Well, we did support the police in their operational decisions. They did make requests for the march to be postponed, but ultimately it is really important that these are operational decisions for the police. But I think one of the important issues is some of the individual cases that we've seen around anti-Semitism. It's extremely important that action is taken on hate crime, that it feels the full force of the law. And I am also calling for stronger action against both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, both of which we've seen rise in recent weeks. And at the moment, the government has downgraded some of the monitoring of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I don't think that is the right approach. And they have failed to renew the hate crime action plan. There's a series of things we think they should do, including looking again at some of the law and some of the reports that have been made, because we must have much stronger action on anti-Semitism, as we saw some of the cases yesterday, but also on Islamophobia as well.
Well, as you say, there were placards, there were chants, there was the really rather ugly scene of someone carrying a swastika on one part of the march yesterday. And there is law that exists that could have led to arrest. Do you think that the police actually did their job yesterday on dealing with the extremist element of the pro-Palestinian march?
So again, I'm not going to second-guess the police on individual operational decisions. As we know, some of those cases are still being investigated. The police do follow-up work and further arrests, as we've seen when this has happened. So they are obviously continuing that work, and it's right that they should do so, because we need any case of anti-Semitic hate crime or intimidation to face the full force of the law. One of the points that the police made was that they would have preferred to have additional officers to be monitoring for cases around the anti-Semitic hate crime. But of course, they also had to deal with the far-right groups that were trying to get close to the cenotaph as well.
But you would not be directing the police, essentially, whether it's operational or not, you would not be making clear that you would want to see someone who is carrying a swastika on that march at least investigated directly. You wouldn't have anything to say about that.
Look, those are appalling cases. I've seen some absolutely appalling cases there of anti-Semitism where they need to face the full force of the law. So there needs to be investigations. We want to see where there are serious cases around anti-Semitic hate crime. We need to see arrests made. We need to see proper action and cases taken through the courts. So let's be absolutely clear in that there has to be zero tolerance of anti-Semitic hate crime in our country, and we should be very strong about that. But I think it's also important to recognise that we have to support the police in their work to do that. And what we've seen over the last week is actually attempts by the Home Secretary to undermine support for the police. That is really damaging and irresponsible, and it inflames situations like this.
I want to come back to her, but let me ask you something about your own party. This week, Parliament's going to debate a motion urging our government to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. Will members of the Labour shadow cabinet be ordered to vote against such a motion?
So I think what you're referring to is the debates around the King's speech coming up this week. As I understand it, there are around 15 motions.
The motion that's likely to be introduced by the Scottish National Party MPs calling for a ceasefire.
And as I understand it, there are around 15 amendments that have been put down so far. There are likely to be more, so we don't yet know which ones the Speaker will select. We do obviously have a process which involves the Speaker selecting the amendments, and then the Labour Party will respond to those. So I'm not going to preempt that.
Yeah,
but I assume that you're talking that the wider issue that you're talking about, obviously, it is awful what is happening in the Middle East at the moment.
Yeah, so forgive me if I may
4,000 children killed in Gaza. We've got hostages who are still being held.
It is very likely that a motion will be put down calling on our government to support a ceasefire. Will members of the Labour shadow cabinet be whipped, ordered to vote against such a motion?
And I understand the question you're asking, but I'm not going to preempt the normal processes where we have got huge numbers of amendments down, and those will be selected by the Speaker, and at that time the Labour Party will respond. But Keir Starmer has set out the Labour Party's position in that important Chatham House speech, and obviously there is huge concern about events in the Middle East, and that's why we are urging the immediate suspension of hostilities, the humanitarian pause that we have been calling for in order to be able to have proper both humanitarian aid go in, but also to try and get negotiations to get the hostages released and civilian protection in place, because it is devastating what is happening to the number of lives being lost.
OK, last point. When you next face Suella Braverman across the dispatch box, will you start by thanking her for distracting everybody from Labour's own internal divisions on Israel and Gaza?
Do you know, I think this is much more serious than that. Suella Braverman decided to launch an unprecedented attack on the impartiality of the police, and also to deliberately inflame tensions in the run-up to Remembrance Weekend. No Home Secretary has ever done that before. Her job is supposed to be to support the police and to work with the police, and also to calm community tensions. She did the opposite, and she did the opposite in a really damaging and irresponsible way. We warned her that her words would be exploited by extremists. We warned her that this would be damaging and irresponsible.
To resign.
And it was.
You obviously do regard it as serious.
I mean, she should not. Yeah, she's immensely serious. She should not have been doing this job in the first place. And Rishi Sunak let her, and he is too weak to do anything about it.
So should Suella Braverman resign?
It's really damaging what they're doing.
Should Suella Braverman resign? That's pretty straightforward.
I don't see how she can continue to do this job. She does not have the credibility or the authority to do the serious job of Home Secretary. How can she command the respect of the country around
she should resign.
The police? How can she command the respect of the police? Well, I think this is a matter for Rishi Sunak. I think he needs to deal with this, Trevor, actually. I think he appointed her, and he needs to do something about this, because otherwise all that he shows is he is weak, he doesn't care about policing, and he doesn't care about the security of our country.
Yvette Cooper, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Trevor.
All right, well, let's see what our panel makes of all that. With us now throughout the show are three independent-minded expert insiders. Former Downing Street Communications Director under Boris Johnson, Guto Harry, the former Lib Dem advisor turned columnist, Miranda Green, and the broadcaster, Sangeeta Maiska. Guto, we will come to Suella Braverman and all of that in a moment, but Labour was rather lucky this week, isn't it?
Yeah, as you say, we'll come back to the high principle. But in terms of low politics, it was a bad tactical decision to draw all that fire, all that tension, all that attention towards the Conservatives over tensions over Gaza when the Labour Party was doing a pretty good job of tearing itself apart. Not that I think that party politics should be anywhere near what is happening in the Middle East at the moment, but it's been really harmful to bring that in towards the government and to attract so much attention from that and to create something that is kind of dominated a weekend where really it's one of those times where in a timeless and universal way, regardless of where you come from, we stand still and we remember all the people all over the world that have lost their lives in wars. And, you know, it's so undignified and tragic.
You know this Conservative Party better than the rest of us. What is she up to?
Quite simply, playing to the gallery. I mean, first of all, she's actually, on a personal level, a really lovely person. She's highly capable. She's super intelligent, something that a lot of the commentary ignores. But on this occasion, and on many other occasions, frankly, but this one, I think, has crossed the line, she is playing to the gallery. She is putting her sort of performance, her stature, her reputation with one part of the party above what she should be doing as Home Secretary, which is far more sober and sensible.
Sangeeta, I'm sure you're in the Suella must go party here, but this was fortunate for Labour, I think, wasn't it?
Undoubtedly, but it's interesting, Gitto, you say she's playing to the gallery. Which gallery and who's in it? If we were to look at the most recent polling on Suella Braverman, which was conducted by YouGov last week, members of the public were asked, is she a good Home Secretary? 51% said no, 16% said yes. What this schism, if that's what we're going to describe it as, within the Conservative Party, tells us anything. It tells us that Rishi Sunak is immensely weak. Not only that, he has managed to completely muck up how to deal with her. The minute he released the information, and it would have been released with his permission, that 10 Downing Street had asked her to make amendments to that awful opinion piece that was nothing more than full of hatred and inaccuracies. What he did was say, we're launching an investigation, we're going to, we're considering opposition. What he did at that moment is he set a deadline. So every political reporter worth their salt is now going to be asking him, what's happened to the investigation? When will she be out? And, sorry,
Miranda, we're going to come back to this issue of what gallery she's playing to, because actually there are different areas here. Because don't forget, she's got a party gallery as well. But let's just deal with what has to happen this week. We've got the Rwanda decision coming from the Supreme Court this week, which will be important for the government and particularly for the Home Secretary. What do you think the considerations that are going on in number 10 and in Mr Sunak's head are, Miranda?
Well, it's very difficult for the Prime Minister, isn't it? Because he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't in terms of, you know, hoiking Suella Braverman out of the cabinet. If he leaves her in place, this becomes an ongoing row. She's doing a very good job of increasing her own, you know, name recognition and position for a potential leadership election after a Conservative defeat in the general election. But if he puts her onto the back benches, she becomes a kind of fulcrum for discontent inside the parliamentary Conservative Party over what could be a really rocky year leading up to the election. So it's a really difficult consideration for a weak Prime Minister. It wouldn't be a difficult consideration for someone who was already in a strong position. But of course, he has no personal mandate himself from the electorate. He has people, you know, barking from one side saying this is not a true Conservative government. We need tax cuts now in the run-up to the November 22nd autumn statement. And he's got the moderates very unhappy with the direction of the Home Office. I think he's in a, you know, in a genuine quandary about what's the best way to act. on this particular question
Can I
of
ask
his
you-
Home Secretary. But also, can I
Sorry,
just-
Miranda.
Yeah. I just also want to say, you know, her excuse for attacking the police was, you know, my first responsibility as Home Secretary is keeping the country safe. It's extremely obvious that her remarks have not helped keep London safe this weekend, and that her first consideration is her own career.
And she went further. She went further. She endangered the public.
Yeah,
because what she
exactly.
did with her words in that article was embolden the far right in this country. Be in no doubt that's what happened.
So I actually think it's very serious.
I want to come back to the policing thing, but I want to ask you, Gudra, a sort of semi-technical question. She wrote this article, and normally when cabinet ministers make some public pronouncement, it has to be run by number 10. And then when you were Director of Communications, presumably it would have gone across.
It would
your
have been
desk.
on my desk. Yeah.
Now there's a question about number 10 apparently demanded some changes, and some changes were made, but not the ones that they wanted. What would you have expected, and what would you have done in that situation?
First thing, I'd have known that I would have got kicked really hard that this had happened, even though, you know, I was not the person who wrote the article. So that's a sort of, it puts the whole team under pressure. But that's by the by. In the end, I was conscious, as unelected cabinet ministers are elected, so they're meant to be big people who actually, in some ways, have the final say until the Prime Minister's involved. Now, on this occasion, the Prime Minister clearly wasn't happy with the article. The article has still appeared. The article has created an enormous mess. And so it is, frankly, impossible to avoid the situation where Rishi Sunak's authority as Prime Minister is now on the line, because he clearly did not agree with this, did not want it there, and a Cabinet Minister has defied him. So the answer is quite simple. So the only question is, on what basis? What does he write, or what is the person who's going to write his response to her forced resignation letter? What are they going to put there? Are they going to say this is a dull matter of process? No. What he needs to do is to say this is a matter of high principle in the end. We as Conservatives traditionally back the police. We as Conservatives traditionally back free speech. We as Conservatives traditionally do not inflame tensions. And on those big issues of principle, there's a massive failure here.
What I'm hearing from you, Guto, is that tomorrow there's a sacking.
It may not be tomorrow because there are other considerations, but when you hold on for the next thing, then there's another thing, then there's another thing, then you've missed the moment. So I think, you know...
But she's got to go, right? Is your point?
I don't see any way in which you want to go to the next election and say, this is what we stand for. We are a party that will inflame tensions, that will undermine the police ahead of a big weekend like that. That's not a pitch to the electorate in the end. It may help with a tiny, loud group of people, but not with a mass public.
May I just briefly jump in? The only thing that I have a problem with in your high principle argument is that we have Suella Braverman, that we all agree was actively undermining Mark Rowley and interfering with operational aspects of policing that she shouldn't have been. The problem here is that Rishi Sunak then doubles down on it by saying, well, actually, the marches are disrespectful, and then summons Sir Mark Rowley up to 10 Downing Street to try and explain himself. And that's where...
The sequencing of that was the other way around, but I take your point.
But that's where Rishi Sunak has lost the high ground.
But it's great for Yvette, though, isn't it? Because she can do show, don't tell, which is what you're supposed to do in politics. And she can be the one saying, I'd just like to thank the police.
Yeah, I know.
Which is what, you know...
It's amazing. Everybody except Suella Braverman this morning is super reasonable. Let's just come back to the actual events yesterday. One of the things that is clear that's come out of this, actually, Sangeet, is that Rowley seems to have been right, actually. He said... this isn't going to be the level of disturbance that needs banning, and we will control it. Isn't that the main thing that comes out of this, that actually those around Suella Braverman and she herself made a mistake in misjudging what was likely to happen this weekend?
Yes, and what I find extraordinary is that they thought they could take on Mark Rowley, who, of course, has a background in terror policing, and he will have available to him a range of intelligence that none of us will ever see. Presumably, if he had had a conversation...
Well, she would have seen it.
Well, I'm coming to this point. Presumably, there would have been a communication, I'm assuming, between the Home Office and the Metropolitan Police, and that information should have been shared upon request. This was a massive policing operation, 2,000 police, 24-hour guard around Senegal. Hang on a minute. And what we know is Mark Rowley was in control. And what I and other members of the public, I think, are concerned about is that we have both the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary undermining Mark Rowley.
Let's not judge what them... I mean, and Suella Braverman is not here to explain her case, so it falls to me at some level. I think that she would say that actually, though this was not apparent from the article she wrote in the Times, but I think she would say that she knew from whatever intelligence they had that there was going to be some problem with the right, and that's what she was worried about. Is there anything at all, Miranda, in what she said that we ought to really take seriously, or is this just...
Well, I think Sangeeta's point's really excellent, actually, because it's not as if the Metropolitan Police has been absent from the headlines for the wrong reasons over the last couple of years. So actually, the fact that the Metropolitan Police did remain in control and do a good job is something that we should all take a lot of comfort from, given what's been going on there, and that Mark Rowley's been brought in as Commissioner to sort out a very troubled institution itself. So I think, actually, in her article, the problem was if you undermine the police and say the police won't be able to control this protest, which is to do with very complicated international allegiances, you are going to get people who call themselves defenders of England turning up, and then you're going to get confrontations. The most chilling thing about all that footage from yesterday has got to be a member of the far right waving a policeman's helmet as if it was a sort of battle.
For me, the single biggest problem was that
and that is down to
hundreds
her.
of thousands of people who are concerned on a humanitarian grounds about what they witnessed in another part of the world were dismissed en masse as hate campaigners. That was, for me, where the moral transgression was. Everything else is kind of quite technical.
She did,
but that was insulting.
And she raised a couple of good points in the article, actually.
All right, let
to answer
me...
your question.
Let me put one thing to all three of you. Everybody's being very, if you like, high-minded about operational independence of the police. I've got to say, I personally find that I'm a bit uneasy about that, because I don't think anybody was going on about the operational independence of the police after the way that the Metropolitan Police handled the Sarah Everard vigil. I think most people wanted them not to have as much operational independence at that moment.
I'm with you on that, Charlie. It's not an absolute. And in the end, the police cannot be sort of literally above the law, and they are accountable to the democratic government of the day, whether you agree with that democratic government of the day or not. So absolutely, in principle, a Home Secretary has a right. But cleverly, you would call somebody in if you were really concerned and wanted it to be put right, not have this whole thing in public.
All right, hang on, guys. I've got to stop you. We'll come back to you because we have the Defence Secretary on the line at the Cenotaph, and we are going to talk to him about that. Defence Secretary, can you hear me?
I can, loud and clear.
Good morning, Mr. Shapps. Now, you've got a special role as Defence Secretary in today's rituals. I just want to ask you the same question I asked Yvette Cooper. Why do you think that this set of rituals still has relevance to us?
Well, not least because there's still conflict going on in the world. We've all seen what's happened, not just in the Middle East very recently, but of course for the last year and a half in Ukraine. And I think it affects people because we understand that freedom is not free, that people lose their lives when there are these wars. And today, as with yesterday at the Cenotaph, on Armistice Day, we'll be laying wreaths to remember the tremendous ultimate sacrifice that too many people have given for the freedoms that we enjoy today.
One of those freedoms is, of course, freedom of expression, and some people exercised that yesterday, I think mostly in a good way, some in not such a good way. The Prime Minister called yesterday's demonstrations, or some of yesterday's demonstrations, disrespectful. Would you rather that the pro-Palestine demonstration had not taken place this weekend?
Yeah, I think it would have been preferable, if I'm honest, if this weekend had been entirely one about remembrance. It's a solemn occasion. It's an opportunity to reflect, and noisy demonstrations don't help people do that. So I think it would have been preferable, of course. But I also respect the right of people to demonstrate. It is literally what, my grandfather and my great uncle and many, many others in this country went and fought for, with the freedoms to be able to do and say these things. There is a limit, and that's where people breach the law. I was here in Whitehall yesterday, and unfortunately hearing from some of those extremists who were here purely to disrupt proceedings, purely to cause problems, many of them arrested. And then, of course, on the marches, some people there with banners, some people shouting things which clearly breached the law as well. But it is worth saying, I think the vast majority of people this weekend will be doing what we're doing here, which is remembering the war fallen, those who've risked and lost their lives in some cases.
I was there too, Mr. Shapps, and I saw exactly what you just described. But it sounds from what you've just said that actually you agreed, leaving aside the language and the timing and all of that, but you agreed with the substance of the Home Secretary's case, that actually this was not the weekend for this demonstration.
Yes, I think that's right. I think on balance, decorum this weekend would have been the best route through, but it is undeniably the case that we live in a democratic free society, and actually part of what people who've lost their lives fought for was the right and ability to protest. That is not the same as the right and ability to abuse the police or to break the law or incite racial hatred, of course.
And Mrs. Braverman's supporters this morning are saying that actually what happened turned out to be exactly what she predicted. 126 people arrested, most of whom were far-right hooligans. Michael Gove mobbed on his way back from his constituency. She's got a case, hasn't she?
Well, as I say, I mean, I think this weekend of all weekends it would have been preferable to focus on remembrance. We saw that incredible Festival of Remembrance televised last night. We've seen what happened, at the cenotaph with people laying wreaths and remembering people who've suffered. I think it would have been better to focus on those things. Unfortunately, there were people who were just set on going in a different direction. As I say, as long as it's legal, that's fine as well. It's where it's illegal that it does need to be prosecuted, and people need to
well, you say it would have been better to
know that there are
focus.
limits.
You say it would have been better to focus on those things, but you weren't helped by your cabinet colleague, the Home Secretary, with her article, which drew attention to the right and some would say encouraged Tommy Robinson and the EDL gang to turn up. The truth is, last weekend, you had Labour on the ropes over their divisions on Gaza. This weekend, Mrs. Braverman has turned the fire on you, hasn't she?
Well, forgive me, tempting as it is to get drawn into the politics of who's up or down one weekend or the other between political parties, I'm more interested
You're
today
a politician, Mr.
in
Shapps.
remembering
That's
people.
your job, isn't it?
I am, but I'm also a Defence Secretary, and the nation is coming together today in particular to remember those who've given the ultimate sacrifice. That's why I'm here today, not to really discuss the politics of who's up or down one weekend or the other.
My question is exactly that. It is your colleague who turned this into a political question, when she accused the police of playing favourites when it came to protesters. Based on what you saw, you are out there, I was out there. Did you see the Metropolitan Police playing favourites yesterday?
Well, look, unfortunately, the police have to respond to whatever is in front of them, and I want to pay tribute to the police and, in fact, all of our civilian services as well as the armed forces this weekend. Part of what we should be remembering this Armistice and Remembrance Sunday. But it is the case that some people just turned up determined. By the way, nothing to do with what the Home Secretary said in terms of having already said they would be here doing these things to disrupt things here at the cenotaph, but also, I'm afraid, elements joining to celebrate what terrorists have done, Hamas have done, and chanting clearly racist things, all of which,
had nothing to
needs
do
to be prosecuted.
It's had nothing to do with the Home Secretary's article this week. But, by the way, just quickly, I noticed that, you've been profuse in your thanks and, as it were, congratulations for the police. Was it just an error that there is nothing in the Prime Minister's statement about yesterday that thanked the police?
Oh, no, just to be clear, the Prime Minister will speak to the police constantly. I think he's meeting with the Met Commissioner.
But he didn't say
recently
thank you,
and will again.
Didn't say thank you, Mr. Rowley.
Well, I think it's starting to sort of pour over every single word. Of course, the Prime Minister is grateful to the police. We all
he's the
are.
Prime Minister.
We see
His
what
words are
they have
important.
to. Yeah, I mean, it goes almost without saying, but I'm sure he'll say it in person. It goes without saying. The police have to do an incredibly difficult job. I do think it's amazingly important that where people transgress the law, not just the thugs, the football hooligans, the extremists that turned up around here and elsewhere in London, but also those who freely go out and chant racist, anti-Semitic remarks designed with swastikas, designed to scare communities. Each of those need to be arrested and prosecuted and feel the heat of what they've done. I know when I was battling with Insulate Britain, who kept disrupting the transport system, it wasn't until I got injunctions in place and people spent time in prison that it stopped. And I think everybody wants to see that action as quickly as possible.
Look, Mr. Shapps, I don't want to bang on about it, but let's just go back to the Home Secretary's article. What she described as a hate march was never going anywhere near the cenotaph. She knew that. The number of arrests, as it turned out, was pretty small, mostly thugs of the EDL. The Home Secretary was not acting as a peacemaker here. She was an agent provocateur, actually.
Look, first of all, you talk about the number of arrests. That's because the police, as they rightly say, were here dealing with with violence, and that moved them away from being able to deal with the main march, where there were certainly plenty of people chanting in a way that would doubtless breach the law. I know the police have put out requests for information and are finding people who were holding up banners which support a prescribed terrorist organisation.
You and I were both there. We saw the people involved. I mean, I can show you the footage that I took on my iPhone if you want, and we know that many of them were only there because this had been created as an item of controversy by your colleague. Are you guys not going to take any responsibility for this?
Look, again, I repeat the point. I mean, of this weekend, of all weekends, I'm here to pay my tributes to the men and women who have bravely given their lives, and I wish we could spend more of this interview on that. I know you want to talk about these other matters. Those people who were going to come and try and disrupt this weekend had already said they were going to do it. They were doing it in their own twisted way because they were protesting themselves against other marches. You ask about the number of... just let me make this one point. You ask about the number of arrests. I'm sure there are far more arrests still to be made from the march that took place yesterday, simply because either the police were distracted here or because they weren't able to intervene immediately, and certainly that was the impression I got. In fact, when I spoke to the Met Commissioner last night at the Festival of Remembrance, he made that point clear to me.
My last go, because I do want to ask you a couple of questions about in your role as Defence Secretary, but, you know, some of your colleagues are saying, and these are not, you know, wild men and women of the left or right in your party, but mainstream members of your party are saying that what's happened here is the Home Secretary, instead of stopping the boats, which is her job, has spent the last week creating trouble for your party, for your Prime Minister, for you personally. These are not words that you would have used. What have you got to say to those who are saying that the Home Secretary really should no longer be in that post, and that we hear some of them are saying that if there isn't a sacking, if there isn't a reshuffle, they will resign? What will you say to those people?
Well, quite simply, the makeup of the government, makeup of the cabinet is entirely a matter for the Prime Minister. He will decide that in his own time. I've already discussed it, I think, at significant length. I don't agree with your interpretation of all of this. These marches were already going to happen. This counter protest was already going to happen, and actually, it is the case that we want to see arrests and prosecutions as quickly as possible.
When I'm here next week, will the Home Secretary still be Home Secretary?
Well, look, as you know and I know well, a week's a long time in politics, and I never make predictions about these things. As I say, it's entirely a matter for the Prime Minister. Today, though, really ought to be, and I wish we'd spent more time talking about it, about the ceremony we're at here and across the country, where people are remembering people who've laid down their lives and helped to protect this country. And that is what this weekend is really about.
Well, I absolutely wish we could have spent more time talking about that, but of course there will be full live coverage on Sky News, which you and others can watch. We are talking about politics, but I just want to, before we leave, just remind everybody that there is something going on elsewhere in the world. A major hospital in Gaza yesterday closed down because it had run out of fuel. No baby units, no intensive care. President Macron's called for a ceasefire. What is our government saying to the Israelis about this?
I say to the Israelis, both privately and publicly, the same thing, which they have to make sure they take every step possible to protect the civilian population, observe international humanitarian law. But something that we all know from when London was bombed in the Blitz, from when we bombed Dresden, for example, is that sometimes civilians get hurt in wars, and Israel has been attacked. Unlike in the Second World War, where that bombing was indiscriminate, Israel are going out of their way to try to protect civilians, making extraordinary phone calls to people to ask them to help clear areas where they know that Hamas are hiding in that network of extraordinary tunnels under the ground. If that attack, that terrorist attack a month ago, had been on Britain, and 1,400 Brits had lost their life in this country, the idea that we wouldn't then pursue the terrorist organisation when we knew where they were, and that anyone would tell Britain that we shouldn't do that, I think would be rather improbable and extraordinary. And I think, therefore, Israel do have a right to do that, but they must try to protect civilians. We support pauses in this action, not least so we can get our own aid through. I've been sending military aircraft out from Brize Norton with aid to the Palestinians. We want to make sure that all gets to the right place. But calling for a ceasefire is in effect to say, don't worry about going after those terrorists. And that is in effect to say it will all happen again, because tens of thousands of rockets and missiles are still underground in Gaza and will surely be used if Israel was to simply stop their current action. So I think it's unrealistic to say ceasefire, pause, yes.
Grant Shapps, thank you very much. I think this is probably the first time I've ever interviewed a cabinet minister with Bach singing Bach in the background. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you.
Right, let's check back in with our panel. Guto Harry, Miranda Green and Sangeeta Maiska. Miranda, no surrender here on Suella Braverman. Not a wobble, really.
Well, you say that. I thought a week's a long time in politics when you asked him whether she would still be in post this time next Sunday was rather pointed, in fact. You know, when the government is in trouble, it's always good if they have Grant Shapps on the broadcasts. He's considered to be kind of human Teflon, right? And he can sort of calm things, brush things away. I felt there was even from him the slight suggestion of a raised eyebrow about some of the inflammatory language from the Home Secretary, although he was being very, very careful. You know, they have got a real problem. You know, you yourself raised with him, there have been widespread rumours across Westminster for some time about a reshuffle. I'm sure Guto knows much more about what might happen there than I do. But, you know, the Prime Minister clearly didn't want to have a reshuffle now. They wanted to wait. And so this furore around the Home Secretary creates another headache for the Prime Minister in the run-up to Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement. So, you know, the whole government will be desperately trying to kind of calm the conversation in the next few days.
I did notice that he didn't rush to the Home Secretary's defence, but I try to be as fair as I can to ministers in trouble. Guto.
First of all, I just remember when you are in number 10 and there's a lot of bad stuff going on, there is something very reassuring knowing that Grant Shapps is doing the morning round, because he just smooths it all away. I mean, it was a masterclass, and congratulations. But in the end, no cabinet colleague has come out and said she was making a valid point. She was arguing X, Y, Z. We back her, and whether it's uncomfortable or not, deal with it. Nobody's doing that. And that's what you do with tough cases. If you were challenging her on Rwanda, there would be plenty of people who'd say, I don't like the language, I don't like that, but there's no easy solution. We've got to suck it up. This is important. So I think she is in trouble in that sense. And a week is a long time in politics. Again, issues with timing. But, you know, in the end, the issue is the world cannot stop. The world has to pause and remember the war dead, but it cannot ignore what's going on at the moment in the Middle East. And that's why I think this weekend was inevitable.
I'm not as enthusiastic about Grant Shapps' performance as you are, Gito, but I'll take that on board. What I would say is that Grant Shapps there talked about decorum. Decorum would have been acknowledging very clearly that 300,000 people marched yesterday, as Gito said, largely peaceably, calling for a ceasefire. Decorum would be Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, thanking in his statement yesterday Sir Mark Rowley for doing, I think what we can all agree, was a good job. Decorum would be Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak apologising to Sir Mark Rowley for distracting him in the run-up to a very important policing operation. Finally, decorum would be Suella Braverman recognising that instead of talking about Remembrance Sunday, and which is really what we should be doing, we are in fact talking about her undermining her own party and the country.
I think it's time for us just to take a breath. Up next, I'll speak to the leader of the Scottish National Party at Westminster. That's Stephen Flynn. The Scottish National Party wants to force a vote in the Commons this week on an amendment that would call for a ceasefire in Gaza. The Conservatives and Labour oppose calls for a ceasefire, with Sir Keir Starmer arguing for what he calls a humanitarian pause. Now, that's led to a deep division in the party, which could be exposed further by any vote. So, is the SNP playing politics here? Well, the party's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, joins me now. We'll talk about the politics in a moment, but what do you think this morning means to Scotland specifically, especially the younger generation born, decades away from a global conflict?
Yeah, indeed. I think that remembrance is certainly Remembrance Sunday is something which, for all of us, whether you're in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England, or indeed further afield, means a huge amount. People sacrificed so much for us to be able to enjoy the lives that we do today, and we can never forget them and forget the sacrifices that they've made. It's a real privilege for me on an individual basis to attend the cenotaph today, and I'll be doing so knowing that my late grandfather, who served in the Second World War, would be watching on with a bit of pride.
Well, I think you're the youngest of the party
Just
leaders.
about.
Yeah, the party leaders. And I'm interested in how this feels to somebody who maybe is in their 30s, why this matters, because we haven't had that conflict in their lifetimes.
In fairness, there has been a significant level of conflict, be that in Afghanistan, be that in Iraq. There is a lot of modern-day veterans whose sacrifice we need to remember as well. Okay. There's members of my extended family who I know have fought in conflict in recent times as well. And, we need to pay tribute to their service, because when they are serving, they're doing so on all of our collective behalfs. And that's something which is incredibly important to me and incredibly important to the Scottish people. We're
going to talk to some of those later in the programme, I hope. But now, this week you plan to introduce a motion to Parliament calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. It's not going to pass because Tories and Labour won't vote for it. Is this just a ruse to embarrass the Labour leadership?
No. And, I've heard this implied quite a few times in recent days, and when it is implied, my heart...
Well, it's hard to see what other reason you're doing it for.
Well, my heart sinks a wee bit when people do imply this, because what we have in Gaza is a collective punishment of the Palestinian people. I'm sure everyone watching is aware of the stories which have emanated from Gaza in recent weeks, the fact that there is no food, there's no water, there's no medicine, there's no fuel. And of course, just yesterday we were reading about the fact that babies in ICU units are dying because they don't have access to oxygen. This is a humanitarian catastrophe, and the best way to deal with it is a ceasefire. A ceasefire allows us to uphold international law, to protect civilians and to promote peace. And I think all of us as parliamentarians should want to do that.
But it's clear that the motion's not going to pass, so why take up parliamentary time with that?
So it's been a significant number of weeks now since October the 7th, and the House of Commons hasn't had a vote in relation to the UK government's strategy on this matter. Now, I don't support humanitarian pauses because I think they pose more questions than they do provide answers. What happens at the end of a 4-hour period? Do we simply go back to bombing people but with a little bit more food in their bellies? What happens to the land that they've moved from? Because, of course, Israeli forces are trying to forcibly displace people. And are they going to get that land back? And certainly given what's happening in the West Bank at this moment in time with a very aggressive settler movement, which, as I understand it, is against international law, a lot of us are concerned about that.
All right. Some people would say, cynics, not me, would say that this is partly a way of deflecting from the SNP's own troubles at home, and that we don't need to go over the full thing of motorhomes and 600 grand questions and the police digging up your former leader's garden. But let me just ask you directly, when do you expect the former leader of your party, Nicola Sturgeon, to be charged by the police?
I have absolutely no idea what the police are or aren't intending to do, and they should be able to operate free from the influence of politicians. Now, that's in stark contrast. My view, of course, is in stark contrast to the likes of Suella Braverman, who in recent days has sought to direct the police.
Let's not deflect. Let's deal with your problem.
No, it is important that we have this discussion because, of course, it'd be very easy for me to say that the police are doing something wrong, but the police are independent of politicians and should be allowed to get on with their work free from fear or favour.
Well, we have spent a lot of time talking about Suella Braverman. Let's just deal with you. You are the third largest party in our parliament. You run Scotland. But this shadow is lingering over your party. Mm-hmm. At what point do you expect, then, for us to know what happened. Where did this motorhome come from? What's happened to 600,000 quid? How is this process going to be unfurled?
I can assure you that I would want to know the answers to these questions as much as you do, and indeed a lot of the viewers back home in Scotland would want to know the answer to these questions. I guess my role is very simple. You know, we're referring to is this me trying to deflect? My role is to try and be the best voice that I possibly can be for the people of Scotland in Westminster. And you know, next week affords us the opportunity to be that voice, to stand up for international law, to stand up for civilian lives, and to stand up for peace. And that's why people send parliamentarians to Parliament, to stand up for their priorities and to stand on their principles. And that's what SNP MPs will be doing.
Stephen Flynn, thank you so much for your time this morning. In just a moment, we're going to focus on this morning's remembrance event and go live to Horse Guards to speak to 2 veterans. At 11 o'clock today, the nation will fall silent to remember all who were injured and killed in wars. Veterans from across the UK's armed forces will march past the cenotaph. They're gathering in Horse Guards Parade now, from where I can speak to veterans Lexi Daniels and Mick Faulds. Good morning, Lexi. Good morning, Mick. thank you for taking the time with us. I know it's a busy morning for you. Lexi, why is this day so important to you and other veterans?
Multi reasons, really. For myself personally, it's about being here representing Blesma, which are a charity for limbless veterans like myself. And they're a charity that have helped me an awful lot. So when I initially had my amputation, which started from an injury that I sustained when I was a soldier in the army, years later I ended up having surgery, which led to an injury. I was at a low point, really. And Blesma were there. They literally helped me through it. They helped me through absolutely everything. They helped me emotionally as well as financially. And they are literally the reason why I can honestly say why I'm here today. So being here to be here, represent them, and it's just absolutely wonderful, to be honest.
Mick, you, I guess, would have similar sentiments about what's going on this morning, why you're there.
Yeah, very much so. I sort of amplify what Lexi says. Blesma took me up when I was in a very dark place and sent me away with other veterans who are in the same position as me, and really changed my life quite a lot, amazingly.
Mick, when you go past the cenotaph today, what do you think your feelings are going to be? Presumably, part of it will awaken very bad memories as well as pride in being in that company.
Personally, for me, no, there's no real bad memories. I obviously, my thoughts are with all those that have died in previous conflicts. So, yeah, my thoughts are always with that on this day.
And Lexi, your feelings this morning, it must be a very difficult time.
Yeah, it is. I think it is for a lot of people, really. So it's going to be quite an emotional morning. It's also going to be a very proud moment as well, I think, for everybody here. Just simple things like being with that camaraderie again. So when you leave the military, you have that camaraderie when you're with your when you're around people, and having that again when you're back in this sort of environment is absolutely wonderful. And so there's that joyous occasion where you're back, you feel like you belong again, and having that is absolutely wonderful. But going to the cenotaph and being there is going to be, I'd say, yeah, extreme. I can't actually think of any other words other than extremely emotional. I have lost a couple of people in conflict. They weren't, fortunately, very close friends, but I will definitely be remembering them and everybody that's lost their lives in any conflicts at all.
Lexi, Mick, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning, and I wish you both the best for today and the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's try to put this morning's events into a wider context, both the wars of the past and also the conflicts the world faces today. And I can now speak, I'm pleased to say, to the historian Niall Ferguson. Good morning, Niall.
Morning, Trevor. Good to be with you.
You'll be going to a service with your family later on today, as will many people. It struck me when I was thinking about this morning that in recent years, until rather recent years, this Remembrance Day was something which seemed to be for older people a bit, but in the last few years it seems to have become much more something for the whole nation and acquired fresh meaning. What do you think that's about?
Well, I think it's partly because those of us who, as I did, had grandfathers who served in the world wars want to try to communicate to our children and our grandchildren what it meant, what the significance was of the sacrifice that members of that generation made. It's worth just reflecting on how many Britons lost their lives in the world wars. In the case of the First World War, it was 890,000 In the case of the second, somewhere close to 460,000. These numbers are stunning when you consider that in all the wars Britain has fought since 1945, the death toll is actually just over 8,000. And that's to say nothing of all those people, like the people you just spoke to, who came through the war alive, but with terrible injuries that they had to live with for the rest of their lives. So I think the reason I'm taking my younger children this morning to a remembrance service is so they can learn the enormous historical significance of what happened in the world wars and in the subsequent wars that Britain has fought.
That must be part of it. But I'm also struck by the fact that we see a lot more in this generation about what war is like. You know, we are reporting it 24 hours. It's all in the newspapers. There's all sorts of stories. And in fact, we know a lot more about what is happening in these conflicts than our forefathers and our foremothers, I suppose, would have known a century ago. Do you think that's making a difference?
I'm not sure I agree with that, Trevor, because every family in this country was directly touched by the world wars. It'd be very hard to find a family that didn't have some male relative who was in the forces, or for that matter, a female relative who had to endure the Blitz, who had to endure German air raids. And it's not as if people didn't talk about the experience. I learned a great deal about the wars from talking to my grandfathers. So in some ways, I think we're more removed from it, because to see war on television is not the same as to hear it described by people who have fought in the front line. And that's an important distinction, I think, which we sometimes lose sight of. But I'm heartened by the fact that remembrance services are happening all over the country. And I'm very heartened by the fact that they're not only attended by people who've served, but by those like me, civilians who haven't served, who nevertheless want to pay respect to those who paid this ultimate sacrifice. I mean, this is a free country because of those sacrifices. Let's not forget that that's the real significance of what we commemorate today.
That, of course, is a question that's come up already in our conversations this morning. We saw some best described as ugly scenes in the streets of the capital yesterday, but one of our interviewees did make the point that, in a sense, that's what in some sense, rather, that's what all of this is about, that the freedom for people to disagree is what all of those people fought for. I'm interested in your view about whether, if you like, this kind of this national trauma, which is what war always is, can in some ways be turned into an opportunity to unite people in difficult times.
Well, let me say, Trevor, that I think it was very inappropriate that a demonstration took place yesterday in London, and no matter how much one may sympathise with the plight of people in Gaza who are not involved with terrorist organisations like Hamas, this was not an appropriate day for a demonstration on that particular issue, and nor was it appropriate for members of far-right organisations to try to create disruption. And this is not, I think, an appropriate sequence of events to happen on a day which is really sacred in our national life. On the other hand, and I'm sure my grandfathers would have agreed with me saying this, they did fight for the right of people to protest freely, as long as they don't cross the line into disorder, which of course did happen yesterday. And in that sense, I think one just has to accept that the price of living in a free society is that people will express views with which one disagrees at times that seem highly inappropriate. My sense, when I look back over, well, it's more than a century now that we've been marking Remembrance Day, is that it's a strange feature of British life that there have been protests at this time. In the past, too, there were protests very early on in the early 1920s on Remembrance Day, when unemployed veterans protested that they hadn't been given the homes fit for heroes and the jobs fit for heroes that they'd been promised. So I think this is a good and ultimately a fundamental feature of British life.
Niall, you used the word sacred there. I thought that was a very interesting way to think about this. And I am reminded that there is just one inscription on the cenotaph, the Glorious Dead, which I think were the words of the Nobel laureate Rudyard Kipling. But there are no religious or political symbols on that. What do you think they were thinking about at the time when, as it were, this was created?
Well, the armies that fought the world wars were vast armies, and they were composed not only of Christians of multiple denominations, but there were also Jewish soldiers. There were Muslim soldiers, because remember, in the First World War, it was an imperial army that was fighting. And so there was a consciousness at the end of the war that one could not define too narrowly the nature of the sacrifice that had been made. And I think that was why when Sir Edward Lutyens designed the cenotaph, he carefully avoided any iconography that would have been specifically Christian. Nevertheless, most of us are going to a church today. I certainly will be going to a church later today, because this is still a majority Christian country, and most of the language that we use in remembrance services is distinctly Christian. But I think it's right that this should not be seen as a specifically Christian remembrance, because, as I said, men and women of all faiths lost their lives in the world wars, and that's an especially important thing to remember today.
Niall Ferguson, thank you so much for those reflections.
Thank you, Trevor.
In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Yeah, not too bad, actually, thanks. Yeah, like, genuinely, it's...
It may kick in tomorrow.
Yes, I have no doubt I'll feel terrible tomorrow, but still riding the high at the minute.
So you ran from Manchester to London, took you 11 days, and you have described this as a warm-up for what you're going to face in the South Pole, because nobody with a disability has done what you're planning to do in the South Pole. There's never been a challenge unassisted there. So talk me through the training if a casual 11-day run from Manchester to London is part of the prep.
Yeah, so it's kind of, it is pretty full on, I guess. It's lots of time spent doing like long distance stuff, and one of the big problems I have is I've got to put on a load of weight as well, which I sort of don't do particularly easily. So you know, sort of get home from this, eat loads for a month, you know.
I'm liking the sound of this part of the training, I must admit, especially getting into the winter period.
You know, some bits are a bit easier than others, yeah. So, but then I've got, you know, 4 months in Sweden this winter. So sort of preparing, getting myself technically ready for everything to come, making sure that I'm sort of happy and confident in all the skills and drills that I need to sort of survive and you know, not deteriorate when I'm down there. You're not competing against anyone else. You're just against the environment you're in, and that's what's out to get you. And you know, we're really fortunate today. Loads of really good technology, etc., to keep us warm, keep us safe. So from my point of view, if I do my job properly, I'll be absolutely fine. But I need to make sure that I'm proficient, trained well, competent, etc., to enable myself to do all of that. But there's nothing stopping me from doing that, I think. One of the biggest problems I had was that exactly like you said, I just commissioned into the army. I had literally, you know, that was step one of what I wanted to be doing. And I was really happy with it, etc. And at the point at which I got injured, it destroyed everything that I felt I'd worked for. And that was really hard for me. And I found it really difficult to figure out what it was that I wanted to do after that and what I felt I could do after that.
What life would look like.
Exactly. And I think that, for me, I think it's really easy to limit your own self-belief, not just around disability, but just in terms of what people are capable of. And I personally have enormous belief in people's ability to do stuff.
Time for one final chat with our panel, Guta Harry, Sangeeta Maiska and Miranda Green. As you know, we like our polling on this programme, so here's a few that have come out this week. These first two were conducted before the events of the past week, but they're still telling. This is the favourability rating amongst the general public of top politicians. Suella Braverman comes out as, surprisingly, the most unpopular. None of them are coming away that well, but I guess Keir Starmer gets a prize for the least unpopular amongst these five. But that was all voters. But let's have a look at what happens when you ask Conservative voters. Suella Braverman is now amongst the most popular at plus 43%, pipped only by Kemi Badenoch and James Cleverly. Rishi Sunak, of course, is way back there on 7%, much less popular, and Jeremy Hunt and Therese Coffey are bringing up the rear. Let's have a look at what all that's going to mean for a general election. And there we go. There are the numbers. Labour is on double the Conservative vote, and they, in turn, have practically halved their vote share since 2019. And now, as we always say, it's just one poll, but it maps pretty closely to a trend that we've been seeing for some time. And here's Sky News's tracking poll. The gap between Labour and the Conservatives is now as wide as it's been for over a year. See, they're from January 22. Pretty awful news, Guto, for the Tories.
We started the programme saying Suella Braverman is playing to the gallery. You can see which gallery she's playing to. And the tragedy for me is that too many Conservatives are looking at the last poll there and thinking the next election is already lost. And so they're playing for the spoils. The spoils are not worth playing for. There is no point being the leader of a tiny rump of a party in opposition. So the advice and the message that should go strongly from number 10 and from the party to all of them is stop playing for this pathetic little horrible prize that won't be worth having. Get with the programme, get with the team and close the gap on the last one.
You shouldn't be talking about your fellow party members in that way. They're not a horrible little prize. They are principled.
No, leading a party that's a rump of what it has been in opposition, that's the horrible prize, not horrible people.
Okay.
It's a horrible, horrible job. But you do see that there are people there who, you know, James Cleverly barely puts a foot wrong. Steve Barclay beavers away really hard. These are the people who are helping the team, hopefully, for them close the gap between now and the next election. Those who are just playing for that post-election prize of leading a sort of opposition party, what a miserable job.
There's an obvious point about those top three, which I want to come back to. But Sangeeta, is there a danger for the left here that that actually you might be better off having Suella Braverman doing what she's doing, staying in government, because though she might attract committed Conservatives, she's obviously putting off a lot of other people.
I mean, I don't speak for the left, but as Yvette Cooper said to you, you know, quite clearly when you were doing that interview, she was able to pivot the interview entirely to talk about Suella Braverman and not to talk about the schism within Labour over Keir Starmer's stance on the crisis in the Middle East. So, to answer your question, looking at the evidence, the answer is yes. I would also say that the interesting story there is also about Cleverly and Badenoch, and it's very interesting as it strikes me that Rishi Sunak is very frightened of Suella Braverman. Nobody is frightened of Rishi Sunak. And actually, I wonder when the focus is about to start turning to these two, Badenoch at plus 67, Cleverly at plus 72. They are the people that the Tory party should be focusing on if they don't want to become a complete irrelevance should they lose the next general election.
Miranda, you've been in the strategy seat for a political party. What would you be doing? What would you be telling them looking at these numbers?
Well, I have to say, I agree with Guto. The task for the Tory party should be to mitigate the damage when polling day eventually arrives. I mean, we should say a year is a long time in politics. If a week is a long time, you know, we can't take anything for granted. But if, as we expect, there's a general election next autumn, you know, I was there in Westminster after the 97 Blair landslide, at the point where the Tory party pretty much left the scene for several years because they'd been so humiliated by the electorate that they tried, William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith. They were absent from making a proper contribution to British politics. And actually, we're all the worse off when that happens because it impoverishes our democracy. It makes the House of Commons much less effective at scrutinising what the Labour Party might be doing if they get into power at the election. The Labour Party policy programme is quite wholly, I would say. There are quite a lot of gaps in it. You want a proper, healthy, quite moderate Tory party of numbers to put that Labour government under pressure for all of our sakes. And if they go mad, and as Gito has warned, if the people who want the Tory leadership after Rishi Sunak only try and appeal to the most extreme tendencies of the Tory party membership, their electorate, then we will all suffer, actually.
There is a point here, isn't there, Gito, that actually did the Conservative Party suffer from having a rather poor opposition in the Corbyn-led Labour Party?
Absolutely. It's like sport in the end. The better your opponent, the more you raise your game. And if you can win anyway, there's no point getting out of bed almost in that sense. Now, that's not the position now, but the Conservative Party at the moment is suffering from something else. It's suffering from people who've given up a battle that's yet to be fought. There's a year to go. Some of the economic dynamics, it's quite hard to read them, but some of them are looking as if they could be very favourable. It's not lost yet. And there's nothing in the laws of physics, nor in the pendulum. There is no pendulum that automatically gives the other side a chance every 4 years. You win at this match or you lose it. And the problem is people behave as if they're going to lose. They will lose and lose bad.
Sangeeta, I'm being told that the Home Secretary has tweeted this morning.
Oh, has she?
And what she has tweeted is that she will be going to her the Remembrance Service in Whitehall. She, on this occasion, has nothing to say about demonstrations, which I suppose is... Maybe she's been watching and recognises your claim for call for restraint. One thing that I think is quite interesting about this, if I may just move away from the party politics of it, this is the Conservative Party. What do the top three have in common? Cleverly, Badenoch, Braverman?
They're all people of colour. Is that the one?
Isn't that a surprise? Is that a surprise?
No, not to me. Not to me.
No,
but it's possible. Yeah.
Well, gosh, well, I have no great insight into it. I don't see why it should be a surprise. Should it be?
I don't know.
The truth is the left talk about gender balance. They're obsessed with racial balance. They're obsessed with ticking boxes. But the reality is that the left has failed to appoint one woman to lead the Labour Party in all my time on this planet, and the Conservative Party's had three. And the reality is that a 62-year-old, white Islington barrister is leading the Conservative Party, and that lineup, look at it.
Leading the Labour Party?
Leading the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party gives you a wide choice. As it
You've already put him in number 10.
Hang on a minute. Whose father was a toolmaker, whose mother was a nurse, who worked his way up,
Let's not replay party conference here. Miranda.
At the CPS.
So one thing I think is really sad about our current situation is that in Rishi Sunak, we actually have a Prime Minister who looks like what we would all like modern Britain to look like, and actually on the world stage, after quite a few years of embarrassment, I won't embarrass Gito by saying it's his former boss, but it was.
You won't.
Who embarrassed us internationally. Rishi Sunak looks like the sort of person we would want to be representing us, and it's unfortunately he's come too late.
Okay.
No, hang on a minute. This is really important because there is a counter-argument to this, and I'm not saying it's mine, I'm saying there's a counter-argument, which is what you've got is a Prime Minister who is Winchester educated, who comes from an upper middle-class family, who is immensely wealthy and does not necessarily represent the bulk of South Asians in this country, and actually has a veneer, there is a veneer of diversity. It's not actually inclusive.
We're going to have plenty of time to talk about this again and again. A quick reminder before we go that the best way to set you up for the political week ahead, after watching this show, of course, is to listen to our great new podcast with our own Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, and Politico's UK Editor, Jack Blanchard. That's Politics at Jack and Sam's every Sunday, wherever you get your podcasts. That is it for this week's Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Don't forget you can catch Politics Hub every evening from tomorrow to Thursday, a nightly dose of the great Sophie Ridge from 7 p.m. on Sky News. And as Sangeeta just reminded me, if you want to, light a candle for Diwali. Thank you all so much for spending your Sunday morning with us. We hope you'll join us again next Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Who knows who's going to be running the government then? Goodbye.
This is Sky News Today. It's 10 o'clock. The headlines. The Metropolitan Police says it's actively looking for individuals pictured carrying anti-Semitic placards at yesterday's pro-Palestinian march in London. The Shadow Home Secretary accuses Suella Braverman of deliberately inflaming tensions in the run-up to the Remembrance Weekend.
I don't see how she can continue to do this job. She does not have the credibility or the authority to do the serious job of Home Secretary.
When I'm here next week, will the Home Secretary still be Home Secretary?
Well, look, as you know, and I know well, a week's a long time in politics, and I never make predictions about these things. As I say, it's entirely a matter for the Prime Minister.
Also ahead, the King to lead today's Remembrance Day service at the Cenotaph. Israel offers to evacuate babies from Gaza's largest hospital, where officials say 2 newborns have died after it ran out of fuel. Iceland declares a state of emergency as thousands of tremors raise fears of a volcanic eruption. Plus, panic in an Italian seaside town, and as an escaped circus lion is filmed roaming the streets. Very good morning. The police are looking for people involved in the pro-Palestinian protests yesterday who were seen holding anti-Semitic signs. Hundreds of thousands of people attended the demonstrations across London, with 150 people detained by officers. More than 90 people who demonstrated in far-right counter-protests were arrested after clashes with police. And there is heavy security around the cenotaph today. With the King leading a Remembrance Day service, we'll have more on that in a few moments' time, as well as our special coverage, which starts in around half an hour's time. Now, the police said that the march was largely peaceful, but that they're now actively looking for individuals who were seen carrying a number of anti-Semitic placards. The Metropolitan Police has responded to a number of posts online saying it's working to identify those involved. Well, here with me now is our correspondent, Milena Veselinovic. A very good morning to you, Milena. Certainly a big job for the police this weekend, and they're still working on the fallout of yesterday's protests and, of course, heightened security around today's remembrance events.
Indeed. Well, the Met Commissioner resisted some pretty strong political pressure to ban the protest this week. And that meant also that there were extra resources drawn to the capital from police forces from across England and Wales, an extra 1,000 officers on duty this weekend. We know that more than 1,800 police officers policed the events yesterday. There's more than 1,300 policing events today. But what's quite interesting is that the Met said in their statement last night just how much it took in terms of their resources to try to contain the threat of violence from the far-right groups. And it sort of suggested as well that that distracted them in a way from being able to properly identify individuals with suspected of committing hate crimes in the pro-Palestinian march. Basically, what the Met Police statement said is that the far-right protesters came to London early from across the country, that they were mainly football hooligans. A lot of them were intoxicated. Some of them had Class A drugs on them, and that basically they had to spend a lot of their day, the officers, trying to prevent them from confronting the pro-Palestinian march. Now, the pro-Palestinian march attended by something like 300,000 people, largely peaceful. Towards the end of it, however, there were breakaway groups that were behaving in an intimidating way, and we know that flares were fired towards officers, some of which hit those officers in the face. And we also know there were a number of anti-Semitic placards, there were a number of anti-Semitic chants at this protest. However, the police said that they were so